Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Dowd. I'm a professor of English at the University of Alabama, and I'm a trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America. It was my privilege to serve as the chair of the inaugural SAA First Book Award Committee, which seeks to recognize monographs with a significant Shakespeare component published as the first book-length publication by current members of our association. In 2023, we had 4 outstanding finalists for this award, and we wanted to create an opportunity for SAA members to learn more about these books through a series of short, informal conversations with their authors. So today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Ari Friedlander, who is a newly associate professor, congratulations, of English at the University of Mississippi. His first book, which was a finalist for the SAA First Book Award, is Rogue Sexuality in Early Modern English Literature, Desire, Status, Biopolitics, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. So welcome, Ari, and congratulations.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here with you today, and I'm very grateful to the SAA for this recognition.
And we're grateful to be able to talk to you a little bit more about your book. So I thought I'd begin asking you just to give a brief overview of your book for people who are watching. What are the central claims? And maybe what do you see as the primary intervention of your book in the field of Shakespeare studies?
Yeah, so the book is called Rogue Sexuality, and some people might not know what rogues are, so I'll just start there. Rogues are a term that the period used for, is a sort of umbrella term that cut across a lot of social categories, the impoverished people, homeless people, or the unhoused, vagrants, as they were called in the period, or vagabonds, or simply people who are unemployed, or and then criminals, con artists, pimps, sex workers, or whores in the language of the period. So rural highwaymen, but also urban con artists, so men, women, a lot of different categories. The rogue sexuality is a term that I use in the book to talk about the way that not just sexual criminals like pimps were thought of through sexuality and described with a rhetoric of rogue sexuality, but also but all of these sorts were tended to be thought of as sexually excessive, meaning possessed by a desire for, or an uncontrollable desire for sexual encounters, and that led to their choosing this life of social marginality very often. Moreover, this term rogue sexuality refers to how the period turns this kind of socio-sexual threat into also one of sexual reproduction. So how this desire leads to the social consequence of illegitimate reproduction, and at a mass scale, supposedly. The book traces the movement of rogue sexuality from the period's pamphlet literature, popular literature, often called rogue literature by scholars of early modern England, to a range of different materials, including stage plays, legal treatises, and scientific writing, proto-scientific writing. One of the things that's really interesting about that movement is that one of the things that happens is that what I call the rhetoric of rogue sexuality becomes attached to more socially elite figures as it moves from prose genres to or prose popular prose literature to other genres. So you have a character like John Grant in his bid for membership to the Royal Society, writing about the bills of mortality and sort of founding the modern study of demography, as he's doing this haberdasher who wants to rub elbows with the Royal Society, describes his efforts in ways that evoke, I argue in my third chapter, the rhetoric of rogue sexuality. If you've read the material and you can recognize it, I think it's something that is happening there. And the same thing happens in Johnson's Epicene and Sir Delphine, and Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale with Perdita. This movement has two, I think, main methodological kind of implications. I think that was the second part of the question, right? The first, I think, is that as a kind of history of sexuality implication, there's really influential work that has done so much for the study of sexuality in our period that tries to parse the difference between categories of licit and illicit sexuality based on whether they produce socially disorderly effects. And this is great work because it denaturalizes modern categories of illicit sexuality, and it prevents us from just applying them ahistorically to the past. But one of the things that my book is sort of trying to suggest is that perhaps the social register is not this firm, knowable register that we can use to parse sexual distinction all the time, and that in fact the social register can be produced based on these sexual distinctions and questions of illicit and licit sexuality. So I think, this has broad implications for anybody thinking about categories of sexually licit or illicit behaviors or characters or things like that in Shakespearean criticism. And then the second larger implication has to do with biopolitics, and it comes from that part of the project that's concerned with rogue sexual reproduction. And I'm essentially arguing that biopolitical structures of governance are come much earlier than maybe Foucault thought, and are not necessarily the results of these motiveless movements of science and data, but originate in moralist discourses like those of rogue literature, we need, and by looking at these things, we produce a different kind of archive and chronology of the genealogy of biopolitics.
That's great, thank you. And as you were suggesting, or in your description there, you were kind of giving us a survey of the kinds of materials you talk about throughout the book. I mean, one thing that's really striking about your book is how broad it is in terms of how many different kinds of genres and texts you discuss, right? You really cover a lot of ground. So I wonder, it might be helpful if we can narrow in just a bit, and I'm wondering if you could focus in on one chapter or maybe an example from a chapter that you think helps, give a kind of concrete illustration of some of the ideas, the methodological points you just raised, or some of the bigger arguments of the project.
Sure. I have to admit, I'm a little bit conflicted about how to answer this question, because probably the chapter I like the best, and I think sort of encapsulates a lot of the work that I do, is the first chapter, which is, I think, the longest chapter in the book, about the rogue literature pamphlets. And then, of course, there's the Shakespeare chapter on The Winter's Tale, which I think a lot of the SAA audience might be interested in. So if you'll permit me, I'll try to talk about both of them pretty quickly. So one of the things I really love about the Rogue literature chapter, or one of the things I think that it does well in terms of telling the story of the book, is that it talks about both individual rogues and collective rogues or groups of rogues through the concept of etiology, which is a concept that I was drawing on from Benji Khan's recent book on sexuality and etiology, and etiology meaning the search for origins or causes. And so the first chapter, organizes its discussion of both rogue individuals and rogue collectives through this term by tracing how the rogue pamphlets etiologized individual rogues, where they came from, what their influences were, whether it's learned or bred or born, biological or cultural transformation that happens to the individual to turn him or her into a rogue. And the collective etiologies are a little bit different. They tend to talk about these things through kind of stories of national origins. So where do the rogue people come from? Were they, do they come from this mysterious land called Thievingen, or are they, are they produced from some sort of what Milton would later call a brood of Belial, right? Some sort of sinful genetic inheritance, right? But still a kind of national or ethnic kind of framing. And so I like that chapter because it shows how I like what that chapter does in terms of the book, because it shows how rogue literature provides these very different kinds of views of this what I call a subpopulation of people. But yet there is a kind of unity in the way they tell the story, or at least the political the political kind of implications of the story. And then the chapter ends by looking at how that kind of unity of like these unpleasant or threatening people is totally disrupted by other elements of the rogue pamphlets, including their visual depictions, which tend to, make these people seem tend to blur the lines between this, neat cordoned off subpopulation or this neat cordoned off type of individual and the broader English public who are reading and consuming with ardor these representations. So that chapter sort of gets at both of these questions of how sexuality becomes like a form of a foundation for a certain kind of social status, and also how rogue reproduction forms these kinds of threatening collectivities that need to be biopolitically governed. And then I just want to say a little bit about the Winter's Tale chapter, because I know a lot of people here will be interested in it. One of the things that chapter does that I think a lot of Shakespeareans are really interested in is looks or asserts or traces a kind of connection between the rogue Autolycus, the famous wily, entertaining, singing rogue Autolycus, and Perdita, the chaste, pure princess. The chapter sort of argues that both Hermione and Perdita's sexual scandals need to be understood as relating to institutions of rogue governance, the governance of rogue sexuality, including for Hermione, the church court practice of purgation, which is a big way that early modern England understood or a big way that early modern England regulated sexuality, especially marital sexuality. And in Perdita's case, the sort of abandonment of poor, illegitimate bastards, especially the shuffling or shuttling of bastards across parish lines, that is sort of elevated to the transnational abandonment of Perdita in the Winter's Tale. So yeah, I'm really proud of that chapter because, I think the Winter's Tale has been read many, many times, and as far as I could tell, nobody has ever connected Hermione's purgation with the widespread practice of church court purgation. So I think that might be of particular interest to Shakespeareans looking for a fresh take on a familiar Shakespeare play.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And it's great to hear about both of those chapters, and which, together gives us a sense too of not just what you're doing with Shakespeare, but kind of the whole range of materials you're working with and the broader implications, that come out of these detailed readings. So thank you for that. Thought we'd shift gears just for one question here, in terms of the process of writing, or I guess the work of producing a first book. I mean, certainly writing any book, and I would maybe say especially a first book, it's a huge undertaking, right? In so many ways. I'm just wondering if you might speak just a bit about something that maybe helped you accomplish that goal, or get across the finish line, in putting that project together. Anything that you want to maybe say. I mean, I'm thinking especially about people who might be watching, who are working on projects. They might appreciate hearing just, your perspective on the process.
Sure. Well, I think that I agree. It's a super hard thing to do. I think that especially when you just have like the product at the end, not to get all Marxist, but the commodities can sometimes seem very divorced from the conditions of the labor that produced them, and so I appreciate the question. I think that for me, one of the most important things, and I did, have times when the book was a struggle and harder to write than others. And one of the things that really helped me through those times was cultivating online community with old friends, young friends, but longtime friends from graduate school, and just that I made along the way. Sort of support sessions, gripe sessions, but also writing sessions and working sessions, both with early modernist friends like Marjorie Rewright and Joey Gamble and Stephen Spees. Shout out, you guys. And Colby Gordon and Sawyer Kemp, people who keep you aware and of things that are outside of your little orbit of your book, but also who care about you and the work that you're doing, and are willing to listen and willing to help when you're stuck. I think that was huge for me, and also a friend of mine who I mentioned in the book, who I worked with at a previous job at the University of Dayton, Cheryl Naruse. She really helped me learn how to work online with other people in Zoom, and she's in a totally different field, but just working with each other, giving each other that kind of like accountability, but also support, just was super crucial for me, and empowering, and I can't recommend it enough. Like, I think that this work is often feels very isolating, especially with the job market the way it is, where you're often the only Shakespearean, or one of two, or something like that. That wasn't the case for me in my current job, but it had been in some other jobs I'd been in. And I know it is the case for a lot of our colleagues. And so I think just going the extra mile to put in that effort to try to cultivate and maintain those communities, even when it's hard, and even when you feel like you don't know if your friends will be up to it or things like that, like it's worth it, and everybody benefits. So that was a game changer for me, and now I can't imagine my scholarly life without it. So that's my one tip.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, I think, and finding those communities. And in some ways, it's something that our shift to online formats in the recent years has made more possible, that we can connect with some of these people that are all around the world and the country in maybe ways that were some more challenging, before. So there's perhaps an upside there. But that's great advice, I think. And you just I'll use this as a segue to get to the last question. You mentioned, like, you can't imagine working this, in a different way going forward. So I'd like to conclude by asking you about going forward. What is, now that you've completed this project, right? I'm wondering what's next for you, in terms of your scholarly work, if there's something you're working on you'd like to talk about, and or what thoughts you might have about sort of the future of Shakespearean studies, from the vantage point of, completing a major project and seeing the work that you and your colleagues and friends are continuing to do.
Sure. So I want to talk about the second part first. I think that I think the field of Shakespeare studies is very different than it was when I started as a graduate student. And I don't think I really realized how the ground had shifted under me until really the last couple of years. And I think, I feel like a lot of the work that I grew up on and that I admire from that time was political work. It was critical, theoretical work. But a lot of the time it feels to me, especially in retrospect now, that that work was pitched to other Shakespeareans, and was trying on some level, or as a field, we were trying on some level to show that Shakespeare did critical theory too, right? That there was, and that as long as we could show, as long as we could say, like, you can do studies in sexuality and early modernity, you can do studies of race and early modernity, that we had in some level been doing our job and been doing the kind of work that we needed to do. And I think moving forward, the field is going to need to make, and it's already making, more of an effort to connect to fields beyond Shakespeare studies, and not simply by borrowing methods and then using them in Shakespeare studies, and not even simply by showing how Shakespearean texts or his contemporaries can speak back to those methods, but taking even a further step and showing how the discussions happening in Shakespeare studies connect to discussions happening outside of it. And I think of work like Noemi's recent book or Urvishi's recent book, and the way they connect to discussions happening in contemporary critical race studies as a great example of work that's pushing us to do that kind of work, to take that kind of direction. I think Colby Gordon's forthcoming book from Chicago on trans studies in early modernity is very much speaking to contemporary trans scholars, or scholars of contemporary trans studies. And I think will be cited there a lot as well, and I think and will be of interest, and it's written to be of interest to those scholars. And so I think that obviously scholars have always wanted to be as broadly relevant as possible, or most of the time we have anyway. But I think that the field moving forward that's going to be something that is more expected of most work, and that I think is necessary for the field to survive, because, as I alluded to earlier, Shakespeareans are retiring and not being replaced, and around the country and around the world, and there's going to be, if our field's going to survive, we're going to need to be we're all going to need to be making an effort to not just do what we feel is work that's relevant to the contemporary sphere, but actually pull interest in from those people more actively. And I think that, so you could do that historically, you could do that through performance. I think Sawyer Kemp's book In Progress on access and performance is going to be something that contemporary performance people are going to be very interested in. So I think that's just going to be something we see more and more from a lot of different angles in our field. And the first part of your question was about my work. You know, I physician heal thyself, right? I mean, I think that you know, my recent book, I hope, is of interest to broader queer theoretical audiences with the rethinking of the Foucauldian biopolitical genealogy that a lot of that work you know, draws upon. But you know, in some ways, I do think it was written for, you know, my people, the early modernists. I hope for my next book on which is on the poor laws and disability and impotence, that there is that I hope that I will succeed in writing it towards a broader engagement with large field of disability studies, and you know, that work I hope will be a kind of rethinking of the genealogy of disabled identity. I hope it will engage audiences that are interested in the foundational work in disability studies that often places that kind of work at a later date. I know that it's part of a wave of work in our field that is already thinking around similar questions, including work by Elizabeth Bearden and Alison Hobgood and others. But I think that you know, that's where my work is going, and that's where I think the field is going as well.
That's great. No, thank you. It's gives us a lot to think about, you know, looking forward and to look forward to, you know, I think in the field, and I think there's a lot, you know, that we can all take away from that in terms of what our field should be doing, you know, moving forward. So, well, thank you so much. Again, congratulations on the fantastic book, you know, Rogue Sexuality, and thank you for taking the time to share a little more about your project with the SAA community today. And thank you for being here and for speaking with me. Congratulations again.
Thank you.